They said it would be ceremonial, velvet words, careful applause, a photograph by the marble staircase and everyone gone by noon. But the air inside Lancaster House had the weight of something sharper. This was not just a climate and development roundtable. It was a stage designed to remind smaller nations of their place. Portraits of old monarchs watched from the walls as aides moved like clockwork. Silver trays, quiet shoes, the clink of china that sounded too neat for a continent that bled for rubber, gold, and time. At the far end of the oval table sat King Charles III, posture precise, voice warm in that way power uses when it expects agreement. "We share bonds beyond trade," the king said, hands folded, vowels smooth as polished wood. "Britain will guide where needed. Experience must light the path." Cameras caught the line and held it like a relic. Heads nodded, ministers, executives, development chiefs in tailored suits. No one interrupted. That was the rhythm in rooms like this. Monarch speaks, leaders agree, cameras bless. Ibrahim Traoré didn't move at first. He watched motes of dust spin in a shaft of winter light, listened to the hum beneath the politeness, the quiet arithmetic of influence. He remembered a school in Kédougou that needed windows more than speeches, a farmer in Kaya who called water luck, a miner who knew the exact sound of a rock that hides cobalt. Guidance? From where, to what? Beside him, his advisor Marie leaned in, voice barely above breath. "They expect a statement of thanks." Traoré's mouth quirked, almost a smile. "Then let's disappoint them kindly." He stood without scraping the chair. "Your Majesty," he began, voice steady, consonants cutting clean, "you speak of experience as a lantern. But whose hand holds it, and why is it always pointed away from where we need to see?" A ripple passed through the room, confusion, then focus. The cameras tilted, hungry. "We are grateful for friendship," he continued, "but friends don't stand at the front of your road and call it guidance. They walk beside you and call it respect." A cabinet secretary shifted, a banker's pen stopped tapping. The king's expression didn't change, but the stillness around his eyes did. "Britain will guide you," the king had said. The phrase hung like a silk banner, soft and heavy. Traoré set it gently on fire. "Britain may offer partnership. It cannot grant direction. We walk our own path. Silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's impact, settling." In that beat, the portrait seemed to lean closer. Outside, a siren wailed and dissolved into the London grey. The moderator cleared her throat, already regretting her script. "Perhaps, President Traoré, what you're suggesting is..." "What I'm suggesting," he said, not unkindly, "is that sovereignty is not impolite. It is overdue." Marie's hand, under the table, stilled on a folder labeled water, Phase 3. Traoré didn't look down. He had come to London to raise money without surrendering dignity. He had just made the cost visible. The king folded his hands a little tighter. "Strong words," he said softly. "Strong roads," Traoré replied, "require them." The cameras blinked, the room inhaled. Somewhere far beyond this house, Accra, Nairobi, Ouagadougou, screens lit up, and a different rhythm began. Protocol tried to stitch the moment back together. The moderator smiled too brightly and shuffled her cards. A private secretary glided to the king's shoulder and placed a cream note at the exact right angle, as if geometry could steady politics. Aides refreshed water. A camera light died and came back, its blink like a nervous tick. King Charles inclined his head, the diplomat in him stepping forward. "President Traoré," he said, tone mellowing, "guidance is not command. Britain seeks to share lessons learned, on conservation, education, sustainable finance." "Lessons," Traoré repeated, as if tasting the metal in the word. "I have a few of those as well." The king's eyes warmed, but not with heat. "Then we must exchange them." A development banker seized the opening. "If I may," she said, already sliding a folder across the table, "our blended finance model for Sahel irrigation could unlock billions at concessional rates. Technical assistance, too. It would be transformative." Marie's fingers hovered over the folder without opening it. On the tab, Partnership Framework, UK, BF. The small print beneath, Conditionalities. She didn't need to read to recognize the shape, soft voices, hard terms. Traoré lifted his gaze to the banker. At what cost? The rates are favorable, she said quickly. I asked about the cost, he said, gentler, and returned his attention to the king. Your Majesty, I respect your crown, but where I come from, titles don't carry water. Wells do. A few smiles flickered and died. The moderator tried again. Perhaps we can focus on shared priorities, climate resilience, anti-poaching, green bonds. Shared, Traoré said, is a word that has done a lot of work without ever sweating. Across the table, an older permanent secretary leaned forward, knuckles white on a fountain pen. President, Britain has Stewardship, Traoré interrupted softly, is a story told by those holding the keys. The king held his gaze. The past cannot be rewritten. No, Traoré said. But contracts can. Silence deepened. The portraits on the walls, Victoria, a young Elizabeth, an ancestor in military red, watched with lacquered patience. Outside, a bus sighed past. Inside, a path forked. Marie slid a single paper from her water, Phase 3 folder and set it between the nameplates. A photograph, barely glossy, of a cracked basin in Dory, women queuing with yellow jerrycans under a white sky. No caption, no logo, just reality. The king looked at it, so did the banker. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Charles said, almost to himself, the land remembers. The people do, Traoré said. The land forgives. He let the room breathe. Your Majesty, I don't reject partnership, he continued. I reject the choreography where partnership means I dance to a song paid for by someone else. And your song? The king asked, not unkindly. It begins with this: we walk our own path. Join if you can keep pace. Don't lead if your map was drawn without us. The moderator blinked. The private secretary's pen hovered, then retreated. The banker pulled her folder back, as if it had grown teeth. Somewhere, a clock chimed a polite warning that time was slipping. Protocol whispered to move to the photo op, the shaking of hands, the smoothing of narratives. But the narrative had refused smoothing. The king lifted his teacup, then set it down untasted. Perhaps, he said, a private word. Of course, Traoré replied. I prefer plain rooms for those. A murmur swept the table, half relief, half foreboding. In plain rooms, knives don't clink. They work. Outside, a gray slice of sky opened and a sliver of light found the photograph on the table, turning plastic jerrycans into small suns. The palace aide led them down a narrow, wood-paneled corridor where each step seemed to echo a century of diplomacy. The public theater of the Round Table was gone. Here, the air was cooler, stripped of microphones and polite applause. Only 2 chairs waited by a small oak table, a single tea service untouched in the middle. Charles closed the door himself, a gesture that startled even his aide. No one else, he said firmly. The latch clicked. For a moment, the 2 men simply regarded each other, Traoré standing tall, hands relaxed but ready, the king still and measured, as though weighing which tone to strike. You speak as if Britain's role is a threat, Charles began quietly. Traoré didn't flinch. Not a threat, Your Majesty. A habit. Habits can be more dangerous than malice, they feel natural even when they harm. The king's fingers tapped the armrest. And you believe our hand in Africa is nothing but harm? I believe, Traoré said evenly, that the hand giving bread should not also hold the chain. The king's gaze sharpened. You think I come with chains? I think history does, Traoré replied. And unless you cut them, they rattle even in silence. Charles exhaled slowly, as though measuring the weight of that truth. And if I told you my aim was not to lead you, but to walk beside you? I'd say, show me the steps, Traoré answered. Words are wind. The king allowed a thin smile. You speak like a soldier. I am, Traoré said. But today, I'm speaking like a farmer. You can't plant in soil you've never touched. You can't guide a people whose calluses you've never earned. Silence stretched, but it wasn't empty, it was heavy, layered. Charles reached into his jacket and drew out a folded piece of parchment, old, worn, edges frayed. He laid it on the table and slid it across. "This," he said, "is a letter my great-grandfather wrote during his time in Africa. Read it." Traoré unfolded it. The ink was faded, the handwriting sharp and deliberate. The words spoke of civilizing missions, native management, and resources under stewardship. Every line reeked of a worldview long buried by official speeches, yet still whispering through policy corridors. Traoré looked up. "And this is the map you said was drawn without us?" The king nodded once. "I cannot erase it. But I can burn it." "And then?" "Then we draft one together." For the first time, Traoré's stance softened, just slightly. "If that's true, Your Majesty, then maybe Britain will finally walk, not lead." The king extended his hand across the table. "Then walk with me." Traoré took it, but his eyes held a quiet warning. "Step wrong, and I walk alone." Outside, a bell tolled noon. In the private room, the handshake lingered just long enough for history to feel the shift. The double doors of the private room opened, and the murmur of journalists swelled like a wave. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts, lenses hunting for any flicker of emotion between the two leaders. Charles walked out first, his expression a blend of composure and calculation. Traoré followed a step behind, posture unshaken, eyes scanning the room like a man who had stepped into a battlefield armed only with truth. The podiums stood side by side under a backdrop of Union Jack and the flag of Burkina Faso. A hush fell as Charles adjusted the microphone. "We have had," he began, "a frank and necessary discussion. Britain's relationship with Africa is deep, but it must evolve. President Traoré and I agree, true partnership cannot be built on old terms." Reporters scribbled furiously. It was a polished opening, but everyone's eyes drifted toward Traoré, sensing the real electricity would come from him. When it was his turn, Traoré's voice carried across the hall without strain. "I thank His Majesty for the conversation. But let me be clear, our future will not be written in London or Paris. It will be written in Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Accra, and beyond. We welcome friendship, but not guardianship." The sentence cracked through the air like a rifle shot. A ripple of murmurs rolled through the press corps. A British journalist called out, "President Traoré, are you saying the king's offer to walk beside Africa is not enough?" Traoré didn't blink. "It will be enough when the road is built on respect, not nostalgia." Charles's jaw tightened, just for a second. Then he leaned toward his microphone. "And we are prepared to earn that respect." Another hand shot up. "Mr. President, do you trust the Crown's commitment?" Traoré allowed the smallest pause, letting the tension breathe. "Trust is like a seed. You plant it today, and if you water it, it grows. But if the soil is poisoned, it dies. We will see what grows." The room erupted in overlapping questions, but the aides were already moving forward to close the session. Charles and Traoré exchanged one last glance, neither a smile nor a glare, but something in between. As they stepped away from the podiums, the headlines were already writing themselves in every newsroom from London to Lagos. This was no ordinary diplomatic exchange, it was a clash of eras, played out under the brightest lights in the world. The ornate corridors of Buckingham Palace swallowed the noise of the press conference as Charles and Traoré were ushered into a smaller, oak-paneled chamber. The walls were lined with portraits of British monarchs, eyes that had watched over centuries of empire. Traoré felt them on his back, but he didn't slow his stride. Charles broke the silence first. "You know, President Traoré, diplomacy is a dance. One doesn't step on the other's toes intentionally." Traoré stopped near the window, the pale London light washing over his face. "And yet, Your Majesty, sometimes the music itself is wrong. It forces us to move in ways that betray who we are." Charles's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "You speak of history as though it is a shackle." "It is," Traoré said plainly. "For too long, Africa has been expected to waltz to a tune composed in Europe. You say partnership, but the tempo is always yours. The king studied him, the weight of his crown invisible but palpable in the way he held himself. And if Britain offers resources, expertise, access to markets, what then? Will you refuse on principle, even if it slows your nation's growth? Traoré turned to face him fully. Growth without dignity is just dependency wearing a new suit. We want trade, not tribute. Cooperation, not control. The air thickened. Outside, faint bells told the hour, but inside, the moment stretched. Two leaders, two worlds, locked in a quiet but unyielding test of will. Finally, Charles walked toward a side table and poured 2 glasses of water. He handed one to Traoré. You have conviction. I respect that, even if it challenges our traditions. Traoré took the glass, his grip steady. Tradition can be a lantern, Your Majesty, it lights the way forward. But it can also be a chain. The difference is in how you use it. They drank in silence, the city beyond the palace moving on, unaware that in this small room, the future of an entire continent's relationship with an old empire was being quietly rewritten. That evening, a state dinner was held in honor of Traoré's visit. The palace dining hall glittered under chandeliers, silverware gleaming against white linen. Diplomats, ministers, and dignitaries filled the room, their conversations a hum beneath the soft strains of a string quartet. Traoré sat to Charles's right, an honor in royal protocol. To the king's left sat the British Foreign Secretary, who wasted no time in steering the conversation. President Traoré, he said with a polite but pointed tone, surely you see the advantages of aligning more closely with Britain. Our development programs have kept us dependent, Traoré interjected smoothly, his voice calm but carrying. The clinking of forks paused for a heartbeat. For decades, aid has come with fine print, policies to adopt, leaders to favor, resources to share. Charles set down his wine glass, watching the ripple move through the table. You are speaking to a room of people who believe those programs have done good, he said evenly. They may have, Traoré replied. But good is not the same as freedom. Our soil can feed us. Our hands can build. What we need is respect, not rescue. A murmur ran down the table, some impressed, others offended. The foreign secretary leaned back, lips pressed tight, but Charles didn't flinch. Instead, he asked, and what would respect look like, in your terms? Fair trade agreements, no political strings attached. Investment that strengthens local industries instead of replacing them. A seat at the table where decisions are made about our future, not as guests, but as equals. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Charles lifted his glass. To equals, then, he said. The toast was met with hesitant clinks of crystal, but Traoré noticed the shift, some eyes now carried curiosity instead of condescension. As dessert was served, the music swelled again, but the conversation had changed course. Traoré had planted a seed, and he knew seeds had a way of growing, even in the most carefully manicured gardens. The next morning, Charles invited Traoré for a private stroll through the palace gardens. The air was crisp, the grass still wet with dew, and the distant sound of bells carried from Westminster. Gardeners bowed as the 2 men passed, their footsteps crunching lightly on the gravel path. I wanted to speak without the echo of politics in our ears, Charles began. You have a rare way of speaking truth without raising your voice. But you must know that what you propose will unsettle many in my government. Traoré glanced at the towering oaks ahead. Independence always unsettles those who benefit from dependence. I am not here to be reckless, but to be real. My people don't want to be managed. They want to be heard. Charles paused near a rose arch, running a hand along a vine heavy with blossoms. You speak as if Britain is holding the keys to your cage. Not a cage, Traoré said, but a leash. And the thing about leashes, they can be made of silk, yet still bind. The king's expression tightened, but there was no anger, only thought. You must understand, I have seen leaders demand independence and then lead their nations into ruin. My caution is not against freedom, but against chaos. Then see that we are not those leaders, Traoré replied. Judge us by what we build, not by the fears of what we might destroy. They reached the edge of the garden where the city skyline spread out in the distance, Big Ben, the Thames, a restless London morning. Charles stood silently for a while, then said, "Perhaps there is more we can give you than advice." Traoré turned, measuring the king's tone. "I don't need a gift, Your Majesty. I need space to walk my own path." The king nodded slowly, as though testing the weight of the words. Somewhere, a gardener's shears clicked in the quiet, and a breeze carried the faint scent of lavender between them. That evening, a state dinner was held in Traoré's honor. The ballroom was lit by chandeliers so bright they seemed to erase any shadow. Long tables gleamed with silverware, crystal glasses, and centerpieces of deep red roses. Every seat was filled with a mix of British ministers, African diplomats, and members of the royal family. Charles sat at the head, with Traoré to his right. The meal began in polite conversation, trade figures, climate cooperation, cultural exchange. But the undercurrent was clear, every question aimed at Traoré was a probe, a way to measure whether he was friend, foe, or something in between. A British trade minister leaned in. "President Traoré, surely you understand the benefits of letting Britain guide your economic planning. History shows our systems can stabilize your markets." Traoré set down his fork. "History also shows your systems extract more than they give. Stability for you has often meant stagnation for us." The table went still. Cutlery paused mid-air. Even the string quartet in the corner seemed to play a little softer. Charles cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Gentlemen, perhaps tonight is about building bridges, not counting debts." Traoré gave a slight nod. "I agree, Your Majesty. But strong bridges need equal pillars on both sides." Later, as dessert was served, a young British MP, eager to impress, asked, "If Britain steps back, aren't you afraid of falling behind in global influence?" Traoré smiled faintly. "Influence is not the goal. Dignity is. And you cannot fall behind when you walk your own road." Charles caught the MP's eye, almost as if to say let it be. The room returned to polite conversation, but under the crystal glow, it was clear to all present, Traoré was not here to be managed, he was here to be understood. After the dinner, Charles invited Traoré for a private walk through the palace gardens. Moonlight spilled over perfectly trimmed hedges and marble statues. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine. For a while, they walked in silence, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. Finally, Charles spoke. "You know, Ibrahim, my father once told me that influence is not about force, it's about guidance. That's all Britain seeks, to guide." Traoré stopped, looking at the king under the pale light. "Guidance is a noble word, Your Majesty. But too often, it has been the velvet glove over an iron hand." Charles's jaw tightened, though his voice remained calm. "And you believe Britain still wears that glove?" Traoré glanced at the towering palace in the distance. "I believe history doesn't fade just because the calendar changes. My people remember. And they expect me to protect them from repeating it." The king studied him for a moment. "You are a proud man, Ibrahim. That can be dangerous." Traoré allowed a faint smile. "And you are a patient man, Charles. That can be powerful. Perhaps we both understand each other more than we admit." They continued walking, neither conceding, neither challenging further. The garden was quiet except for the sound of wind rustling through the leaves, two leaders, separated by centuries of history, bound in a conversation that would echo far beyond this night. The next morning, headlines around the world buzzed with speculation. Photographs of King Charles and President Ibrahim Traoré standing together in the palace garden, serious expressions, yet no hostility, circulated across every major news outlet. In a quiet study inside the palace, Charles sipped his tea while reading the British press. "They think last night was just diplomacy," he said, glancing at Traoré, who was reviewing his own country's newspapers. Traoré smirked. "Let them think that. The truth is, it was two men drawing their own lines in the sand." Charles set down his cup. "And yet, neither crossed the other's line." "That," Traoré replied, "is how peace is kept between lions." They shook hands firmly, not as friends, not as enemies, but as two leaders who understood the cost of their positions. Outside, cameras waited for another appearance, but inside, both men knew the real conversation had already taken place. When Traoré departed, the king stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the long drive. "He walks his own path," Charles murmured. "And somewhere in his motorcade," Traoré thought, "and Britain will watch from the side of the road." The encounter had not changed their convictions, but it had carved a new space for mutual respect. In politics, sometimes that was victory enough.